Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Vinyl Den, your channel for record collecting by record collectors. I'm Nick. Today I'm talking about this Rolling Stone magazine list of the 50 most disappointing albums of all time. There's a bunch of links down below. You got links for the Vinyl Den Facebook group, for the merch page, for the Spotify and Apple Music playlist that I put together every week, and the Patreon page. So make sure you check all that out. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button down below, and make sure you hit that notification bell so you're notified every time I release new episodes. So I must have missed this last year. I think it was last November, October or November last year. Rolling Stone did this list of the 50 most disappointing albums of all time. And while I agree with parts of this list, some of it just makes absolutely no sense. And I get it. Music is very, very, very subjective. It's probably the most subjective form of art we have. So you can take 100 people, put them in the room, and they'll come up with a completely different, every person will come up with a completely different list. I get that. But with some of these albums, I think they're just comparing these albums to the most, the most commercially successful albums from these artists, where if you look at these albums in like a vacuum, just by themselves, some of these are really good albums. They're just not as great as some of the albums that those artists created before and after. So I'm going to run through the top 10, and I'm going to go over some of the more egregious errors on this list after the top 10. But I can't really argue with the album that they've got at number one. I might not have this at number one. I don't know. Regardless, it would definitely be very close to the top of my list. But this is Sometime in New York City by John Lennon. It's come out in 1972. I think that there's really nothing that's good on this album. And I think if you look at the albums that came out before this, which were Plastic Ono Band and Imagine, and even Mind Games that came out after it, those three albums are far superior than anything he's got on this album. I get it. He was going through a lot of issues at this time. This is like right at the beginning of his immigration battle here in the U.S., which would be like a big 5-long-year process. And I think that really impacted the quality of the music on this album. And because of that legal battle and some of the issues he had previously, it was a very, very politically charged album, and I think easily one of the worst he ever created. The album that they've got at number 2 is another one I can't complain about. This is one I would actually probably have above that John Lennon album. This is the Rolling Stones, their Satanic Majesty's Request. So this came out in 1967 in the sea of absolutely incredible albums that the Rolling Stones would release in the 60s and 70s. This album is an absolute turd. It was released on the heels of the Beatles releasing Sgt. Pepper, and it was this like big over-the-top psychedelic album, and there's absolutely nothing on this album that's redeeming in any way. Even Mick Jagger is on record multiple times saying how much he absolutely hates this album, and it's probably the worst album that the band ever released. At number 3, they've got Self-Portrait by Bob Dylan. Came out in 1970. This is one of those albums where I don't really agree with Rolling Stone. So Bob Dylan's on the record as saying that he intentionally tried to make this album bad. I don't think it's nearly as bad as everyone makes it out to be, though. I don't know if it's because most of the album is covers. There's 24 tracks on here. Most of them are covers. There's a couple of instrumental tracks on here. There is some good stuff on this album, though. I think mainly it's on this list because it is very different than what Bob had done before. But commercially, it did really well, and it became like a springboard, I think, to some of the albums that would come out after this album. I'm not all that familiar with the album that they've got at number 4, which is Tonight by David Bowie. It came out in 1984. This is the album he released after Let's Dance, which I don't think I listened to any of David Bowie's albums from Let's Dance up until he released Earthling in 1997, I think, when that album came out. But what I have listened to this album, it sounds like he took some of the best elements of Let's Dance and tried to recreate that for an entire album. And I don't think it worked. Would I list this as the number 4 most disappointing album of all time? I don't think so, because I think David Bowie had other issues on other albums in the 80s. It's not like this was like the one lone standout, amongst a bunch of other great albums. Because I don't really think that was the case for David Bowie in the 80s. But we did on this album, it sounded forced, and it just didn't work. The album that they've got at number 5, I have a huge issue with, because this album is not nearly as bad as people think it is. And that's Chinese Democracy by Guns N' Roses. It was released in 2008. Is this album Appetite for Destruction? No. Is it Use Your Illusion? No. But there is some really good stuff on here. I think this album really kind of suffers because of some of the other musicians on this album. I think if you listen to live versions of these songs now, played with the other members or the other original members of Guns N' Roses, These songs sound absolutely fantastic, at least live versions of them do. But the album does lack consistency compared to other Guns N' Roses albums. I think mainly it's because it was recorded over a 9-year time span with a bunch of different musicians, so it really lacked the chemistry that Guns N' Roses had earlier in their career. I would love to see the reformed version of Guns N' Roses go back and re-record this album, because I think there's a handful of really great classic Guns N' Roses songs on this album. And I get it. I can almost guarantee that I'm in the minority when it comes to this album, but I think this is not even close to being Guns N' Roses' worst album. Number 6 is another album that I don't understand the hate this album gets. This is Human Touch by Bruce Springsteen. Came out back in 1992. I mean, what's wrong with Human Touch? I get it. This is not an album with E Street Band. Bruce used a bunch of session musicians on this album, and it's not as great as some of the stuff he'd released before, but there's still some really good tracks on this one. And the album really showcased a different side of Bruce and his music. And had he recorded this album with E Street Band, I think this would be remembered as one of those classic albums from that period from Bruce. So the album that they've got at number 7, I think, is a victim of the album that the band released previously. It was released a year before. This is Smiley Smile by the Beach Boys. Came out in 1967. What hurts this album is that it is the album that follows Pet Sounds. And it's a much more simplified album, much more stripped down. It has this almost lo-fi kind of sound to it. It's still better than a lot of the other albums that were released that year. And I think in many ways, this is a beautifully chill and relaxed album. And like I said, I think it's a victim of, hey, this is the album that the band followed up Pet Sounds with. But if you look at that album on its own and compare that to some of the other albums that the band released later, I would not classify this album as being disappointing in any way. The album that they've got at number 8, I would have much higher on this list. I would probably have this at 2 or 3. This is Stevie Wonder's Journey Through the Secret Life of Plants. So this came out in 1973. This was his follow-up to Songs in the Key of Life, which I think is kind of widely seen as one of the best albums of all time. But this album is different because this is a soundtrack. But I think there was bigger expectations because it is Stevie Wonder, but there's nothing good on this album. This is one where if you've never listened to this album, don't listen to it, because there's nothing worth listening to on here. But I can kind of see the other side of it too, because if this album was created by anyone other than Stevie Wonder, I don't think this would be listed as such a disappointing album. I mean, I think it would still be listed as a bad album, something that kind of would get lost to time, but because it's connected to Stevie Wonder, it has that disappointing tag. Number 9 is Tales from Topographic Oceans by Yes. So this came out in 1973. This is one of those albums where I've got to take Rolling Stone's word on it, because I don't think I've ever listened to anything off of here. I'm not a big progressive rock fan. I never really have been. I know the 3 albums that Yes released before this album were all seen as classic progressive rock albums. So I can see, if you're comparing this album to those, I can see why this would be listed as a disappointing album. The rationale that Rolling Stone uses for the album at number 10 makes absolutely no sense. So at number 10, they've got Invincible by Michael Jackson. Came out in 2001. But their justification for putting this album at number 10 was because by 2001, pop music had been overridden by boy bands. And Michael Jackson didn't take this opportunity to reclaim his throne as the king of pop. Yes, this album is the most expensive album ever recorded, at least at that time. This is a really good album, though. Yes, this is another instance where it's not Thriller, it's not bad, but there's a lot of really classic Michael Jackson tracks on here. I think by the end of this period of his career, this later part of his career, I think he was much more in tune with what was going on musically and what his capabilities were vocally and musically overall. Lyrically, he was fueled by a lot of stuff that had been going on in his personal life in the 90s and early part of the 2000s. And if you go back through and read the lyrics, especially now in 2025, you can see and hear a lot of anger in Michael Jackson in those songs. Some other albums they've got on this list where I think they're completely off base with either where they rank it in the list or the rationale behind it. So the next one is at 27 is Van Halen Balance, released in 1995. Yes, is this a step down from For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge? Yes, but it's still a great album. I would still put this up as, I'd probably put this in the top 10 or 15 albums of that year. And I think in many ways, this is probably one of the biggest stretches they've got on this list. And then number 29, they've got The Final Cut by Pink Floyd, released in 1983. Sure, this was not The Wall. I think mainly this is on here because of the 4 albums that came out before this, was Dark Side of the Moon, Animals, Wish You Were Here, and The Wall. Is it those albums? No, but I think this is probably one of the more underrated albums from Pink Floyd. And it's probably one of the most understood albums also. Initially, when they went into creating this album, it was going to be the soundtrack for the movie The Wall. They ended up scrapping that idea and re-recording it, a lot of it. But, go back through this album. If you haven't listened to this one in a very long time, I would put this up there over a bunch of other albums from Pink Floyd's career. At number 30 is One Hot Minute by the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Came out in 1995. I think this album is on this list mainly because it's not Blood Sugar Sex Magic, which I think a lot of people thought that they were basically going to do a part 2 of that album. But, they brought in Dave Navarro, and musically, he's a very different guitarist than John Frusciante. So I knew there was going to be a big difference on this album. This is one that I still go back to pretty regularly. I think this is one of the more underrated albums of that period of the 90s. And it's very, very far from anything that I would consider a disappointment. And then moving up to number 34, they got Technical Ecstasy by Black Sabbath, released in 1976. This is another one of those albums I think is very, very far from being a disappointment. This was a different album for Black Sabbath. By 1976, rock music was changing drastically. And I think Black Sabbath was really trying to find their place in that rock scene. And what they ended up putting together was, I think, easily one of their most experimental albums. And it's an album I didn't listen to for a very, very long time because of all the negative reviews. Even though I love the Ozzy era of Black Sabbath, it wasn't until several years ago that I finally went back and listened to this album and thought, I just didn't understand what the critics and a lot of people said about this album. And I can say that a lot of the reviews I read about this album are completely off base and 100% wrong. At number 35, they've got Pretty Odd by Panic at the Disco, which I think is one of their better albums, at least one of their more successfully, at least commercially successful albums. And I think the album that came out after this, which I think Vices and Virtues, is easily a much more disappointing album than this album is. And Pretty Odd is the album that is known for Night in the Afternoon. I think it's the one track that they really got Panic at the Disco out in the mainstream. I don't see how they could see this as a disappointing album. I get it that it didn't have the strong emo themes that their debut album had, but there's still some really good tracks on this one. Well, that's all I got for you today, guys. Thanks for checking the show. I'll put a link down below. Go check out this Rolling Stone list of the 50 most disappointing albums of all time. And let me know what you guys think, because I think a lot of this list is crap. But, a lot, like I said before, the very beginning, a lot of this stuff is all subjective. All of it's subjective. If I put together a list of the 50 most disappointing albums, it would be very different than pretty much everyone out there. And I'm sure a lot of people would have issues with what I would put on that list. But let me know what you guys think of it. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. That's all I got. Until next time, keep on spinning. Peace.